Good evening. Feeble growth, rising unemployment and higher borrowing. That's the reality of Britain's economic troubles, and it's all in the context of a potential collapse of the Eurozone. The overall picture presented by the Chancellor in the autumn statement was worse than many had predicted. Mr Osborne acknowledged that growth will be much lower than he forecast back in March, borrowing will be significantly higher than previous estimates, and public sector pay rises will be capped at 1% from next year. We'll have all the reaction and analysis, and we start with our political editor, Nick Robinson.
This was the statement that George Osborne never wanted to deliver. The moment he would have to travel from the Treasury to Parliament to tell the nation that the government will not have balanced the books by the next election.
Our debt challenge is even greater than we thought, because the boom was even bigger, the bust even deeper, and the effects will last even longer.
Those effects, a packed House of Commons was told, would mean more pain now, more pain tomorrow, more pain for longer. Why? Because of what those working behind the door of number 11 have been told by the independent forecasters at the Office for Budget Responsibility. That over the next few years there'll be £111 billion in extra borrowing. That growth next year won't be 1%, it will be just 0.7%. As a result, they predict that in total 710,000 public sector jobs will go. The Chancellor blamed inflation coming from abroad and the crisis spreading from the Eurozone.
Much of Europe now appears to be heading into a recession caused by a chronic lack of confidence in the ability of countries to deal with their debt. We will do whatever it takes to protect Britain from this debt storm.
Whatever it takes means that many of us will end up working longer. The state pension age will be increased from 66 to 67, starting in the year 2026. That will affect anyone under the age of 52. Whatever it takes also means more unwelcome news for public sector workers on the eve of strikes and protests over cuts to their pensions. The Chancellor's decided to tighten the squeeze on public sector pay. It's already been frozen for all but the worst paid until 2012. After that, there'll now be a 1% cap on the pay bill for the next 2 years.
While I accept that a 1% average rise is tough, it is also fair to those who work to pay the taxes that will fund it.
And there was to be more. Although out-of-work benefits will increase with inflation, many tax credits are to be frozen, though not those paid to the disabled. You can see why some ministers might have been wondering when it would all end. The Chancellor had some fresh good news though. Rail fare increases will be a little lower, and petrol rises too.
We are able to cancel the fuel duty increase planned for January, and for the fuel duty from August to be only 3 pence higher than it is now.
George Osborne couldn't claim his plan was on course, but he did insist there was no choice but to stick to it.
Leadership for tough times. That's what we offer, and I commend this statement to the House.
If Labour's response had been just one sentence, it would have been, "We told you so." The Chancellor, said Ed Balls, had blamed everyone but himself.
Families, pensioners and businesses already know it's hurting, and with billions pounds more in borrowing to pay for rising unemployment, today we find out the truth. It's just not working.
If he were Chancellor, he said he'd cut taxes now and spend more to get people back to work.
If after just 18 months his plan is leading to falling growth, rising unemployment and £158 billion more in borrowing, the country either needs a new Chancellor or a new plan.
On the 12th day of Christmas, George Osborne gave to me a tax on single mothers.
This was the day, and the list of those with reasons to protest against government cuts just got longer.
Plan A has failed and the growth forecasts are shredded. Now, he announced a number of important things today, one of which was capital investment, infrastructure investment, but the sting in the tail for that is it's all backloaded after 2013. What we needed was the spending up front now to stimulate the economy.
Tonight we all know what they've known at number 11 for some time. The outlook is bleak. The forecast is it's not going to get better anytime soon. Nick Robinson, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, in a very detailed statement, the Chancellor also outlined a range of other measures Benefits will go up by 5.2% from next April. Basic state pension will increase by £5.30 a week. Mr Osborne announced more than £1 billion of extra money for schools in England. He also gave details of plans to help people buy their own homes. The CBI welcomed help for small business. The government's pledged to underwrite up to £40 billion in loans. There's also an extended holiday on business rates. The Chancellor also confirmed £5 billion in capital spending, with 35 road and rail projects planned across England. So, the figures published today suggest that spending controls and tax measures will have to remain in place beyond the next election to bring down the deficit. It means a squeeze on household finances, thousands of job losses in the public sector. The government will have to borrow more than it predicted. Our economics editor Stephanie Flanders is here to assess the figures.
Thanks, Hugh. Well, a lot of bad news, and it's not all due to the Eurozone or even the Chancellor. In many ways, the real game changer in this statement has come from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. It's decided the growth we've lost recently, we're not going to get back. In the budget, the OBR was expecting national output, or GDP, to grow by 1.7% this year and 2.5% in 2012. Those have been cut today to 0.9% growth this year and just 0.7% growth in 2012. Now, if you think about it, in the OBR's first report, just after Mr Osborne became Chancellor, its forecast suggested the UK economy would be around 13% bigger at the end of the Parliament than it was at the start. It now thinks our national income will grow by just 7% over those 5 years. That would just take us back to where we were in 2007. Crucially, the OBR thinks that loss of national output is permanent. The implication is there isn't much room for a plan B. A lot of extra spending now would trigger extra inflation more than growth. Many economists say that's too pessimistic.
I think it's wrong to suggest, as I think many officials do, that the economy has suddenly lost its entrepreneurial zeal. I think the main problem is really an inadequacy of demand and of confidence rather than an inadequacy of capacity.
The OBR's decision has implications for the entire economy. For example, there are 1 million fewer new jobs forecast over the next 5 years than we expected only 8 months ago. And yes, it means a lot of extra borrowing for the Chancellor. That new borrowing means that Mr Osborne has had to announce not a Plan B, but a Plan A plus. New spending cuts worth £15 billion a year by 2016. Without that extra austerity, the OBR says the Chancellor would have broken his fiscal rules on debt and new borrowing. Back in March, he was due to borrow £46 billion in the last year of the Parliament. That's now gone up to £79 billion, higher even than Labour was forecasting before the election. Back then, Mr Osborne said a government that was expecting to borrow that much for that long would lose the confidence of the financial markets and probably lose us our AAA credit rating as well. Was that true? We'll never know. But it doesn't seem to be true right now, at least as long as other governments are looking even worse.
The market is at the moment engaged in not a beauty contest but in an ugly contest, and the UK looks somewhat less ugly than some of its European counterparts. But when you look at the outlook for the UK, you see that the UK will become the most indebted of the currently AAA rated governments, with the sole exception of the United States. And I think over time there is a prospect that the UK rating could come under scrutiny.
Gloomy though they are, remember all the numbers in today's statement assume the crisis in the Eurozone gets resolved and business and market confidence comes back next year. If today's market fears about the single currency come true, by the time of the budget, the news from the Chancellor might be even worse.
Stephanie, thank you very much.